Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Rotary Club of Seattle. For those visiting, I'm the club president, Mark Wright. It's great to have you here today, and thank you so much. This morning, as I was putting the finishing touches on my script that I had worked on for several hours last night, I hit a wrong button on my computer, and I completely nuked out everything that I was going to say today. So this is either going to be the best, yeah, Carl's clapping, shorter program, that's what Carl wants. This is either going to be the best, most organic, most naturally delivered program, or it's going to be one of the very worst. So I've got the rundown. That's the good news. Okay, for those visiting, we start our meetings with both inspiration and song. So I'd like to introduce now our invocator today. Larry Granat is going to be coming up. After that, David Woodward will lead us in song. Larry, come on up.
Unlike Mark, I do have a script. Please join with me for a few moments. Our God and God of our ancestors, with mercy, accept our prayer this afternoon on behalf of all our country. Bestow blessings upon this land, upon its leaders, its judges, officers, and officials who are devoted in good faith to the needs of the public. Help them understand your rules of justice so that peace and security, happiness and freedom will never depart from our land. We pray, God, whose spirit is in all creatures, awaken that spirit within all the inhabitants of our land. Uproot from their hearts hatred and malice, jealousy and strife. Plant among the diverse peoples of our nation from different nationalities and faiths a spirit of love and companionship, peace and freedom. May it be your will that our land be a blessing to all who dwell on earth and cause them to dwell in friendship. Speedily fulfill the vision of your prophet. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And all God's children say, amen.
All right, our short program today, you're familiar with Ross Reynolds. Ross is one of my favorite people. I wish I could still work in public radio because I absolutely love public radio, Ross. One of the things that I love about KUOW is it's an organization that isn't afraid to do things that are the right thing, but are frankly, risks. The Ask Us series is a beautiful series of radio programs that brings people together that normally wouldn't come together. All in the name of understanding and all in the name of bringing our community closer together. So Ross is going to give us a little profile of that. Please welcome Ross Reynolds. He is the executive producer of Community Outreach. Ross.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I'll let you know when there's the next opening at KUOW if you're interested in that. Most of the significant events in our lives take place because of a conversation. We discover the person that we want to be with for the rest of our lives. A random conversation with a friend leads to a job or a school or an opportunity. Reclaiming conversation has the potential to heal us. We're more divided than ever. This slide shows the attitudes of Democrats and Republicans back in 1994. To the left, liberal attitudes. To the right, conservative views. 23 years ago, you can see there was a lot of crossover between median Democratic and median Republican attitudes. But when you flash forward to 1994, all of a sudden you see that they've pulled apart. Over the intervening 20 years, that crossover has begun to separate. There are two separate mountains of belief in our country. People have pulled apart geographically to places like Seattle and places like the Tri-City. So why is it that we are so polarized? Of course, there's a number of reasons for that, but I think it's in large part because we don't encounter people who are different from us as much as we used to. Rich and poor are separate. Republicans and Democrats are separate. Blacks and whites are living apart separately. And when we do encounter people who are different from us, there's a level of suspicion. We don't engage. I don't think this is a political problem. I think it's a design problem. The design of our lives does not allow us to meet people from different backgrounds. And then when we do, we don't have a way to talk to people we disagree with. We just have not exercised that muscle. So, how can we meet and have a civil conversation with people we mistrust, but at the same time have no firsthand knowledge of? Well, it sure doesn't happen on social media. It doesn't happen at family Thanksgiving. Uncle Harry knows exactly how to punch your buttons. It doesn't happen in argument, because that can go downhill frequently. It doesn't even happen in group gatherings designed to bring people together with different viewpoints, because often we fall into the dilemma of talking to the crowd rather than talking to a single individual. I think that the design we're trying to do at KUOW is a curated person-to-person contact. You can hear some of these on the air and online, but it's more designed for the people who are talking to one another. In 2015, when Donald Trump started talking about keeping Muslims out of the country because they're Muslims, I started to think, how many of us actually know Muslims well enough to have a conversation with them about religion and about politics? So I came up with the idea for the Ask a Project. We reached out to the community of Muslims willing to answer questions from non-Muslims. We did a shout out through KUOW to people who wanted to learn more about Muslims. We got 8 of each together at the KUOW studios in January 2016. The answerers sat in an inner circle, the askers sat in an outer circle. For 6 minutes they talked. Then we rang a bell and the askers moved one chair to the left and began their next conversation. Yes, it was based on speed dating. Then we gathered together in a circle to talk about what we had learned from that discussion. We heard from some of the many reasons that Muslim women wear the hijab or don't wear the hijab. We concluded the afternoon by breaking bread together, and as we can tell from today, that's a wonderful way to get the conversation to go further. We'd really been worried that these conversations might be contentious, but afterward, one of our Muslim participants said, "I wish people had asked harder questions." Participants wanted to stay and talk. Finally, we had to say, "Thank you so much for coming, but please go home. We need to end this event." We were so encouraged, we did the same Ask a Muslim event in August of 2016. It was also a big hit. So why did this appear to work? Well, we think it's the connection that happens when it's just you and one other person. You pick up on their expression, their gesture, their tone of voice. Talking to one person is so much different than talking to a group. They're not Muslims, they're individuals. They're multifaceted people. We thought, what should we do next? Then 2 things happened. That was one thing. Talk about polarization. The second thing that happened was that in the fall of 2016, we got a University of Washington Amazon Catalyst grant to expand this program, making it a larger part of KUOW's community engagement agenda. We knew we wanted to do Ask a Trump Supporter, but with feeling running so high, how could we have a civil conversation? Before we held this event in Bellevue, Trump supporters told me privately they were worried they were going to be harangued by Seattle area people. In the event, there were heated discussions, but fortunately, none of them burst into flames. It worked because our consistent message was civility. Be honest, trust one another, keep an open mind. We also did an Ask an Immigrant event where askers got a sense of how diverse immigrants are. One came to the U.S. for grad school and went right into a tech job. Another lived in an African refugee camp and experienced homelessness before coming to the United States. One was a 72-year-old Mexican immigrant, a former farm worker. Last month, we did Ask a Transgender Person. After the private conversations, KUOW's John O'Brien pulled together pairs of people to record their conversations so we could share the event online and on air and through our social media channels. We've also had a camera crew at many of these events to kind of record what it is that we're doing for presentation later on. We want to know if this design does more than just create a feel-good event. Does it actually improve understanding and empathy? So we got a UW communications professor and a doctoral student there to help us design an objective survey we give before the event, right after the event, and then 3 months later. Here's what we found. Quite encouraging. There's a statistically significant increase in empathy and understanding among the askers who are asking there. Now, you might think that this effect might diminish over time. In fact, our preliminary results show that the askers had even more positive view of the answers 3 months down the line after attending the event. So the design appears so far to be working. The thing is that these are small groups, 16 to 24 people. So how can this design for small group encounters reach more people? I've gotten a number of people interested from business, from social service groups, from churches about the Ask a projects. Just last month, I was speaking to a middle school teacher about organizing an Ask a Muslim event with her middle school students. So we're using what we've learned to try to assemble an online toolkit. So if you like this design for interaction and would like to try it out, you would have a place to go to use this toolkit with all the techniques we have found useful in bringing people together and ensuring they have a civil conversation. Everything from how to recruit and how to screen participants to where to put the chairs. We're going to have that toolkit ready by early next year, and now we're thinking, how can we expand this idea in the third year of the project? We think that if businesses, if schools, if social service agencies and churches find this might be useful through a toolkit and also personally talking with you and guiding you through it, we might be able to help people put on more Ask events and have this grow and get larger. We ourselves have tons of ideas. Ask a veteran, ask a homeless person, ask an atheist. Our website, you can listen to some of the conversations which took place. You can also make suggestions for future conversations and find out more. Our next event is coming up on November 19th. It's going to be called Ask a Newcomer, and we need askers, so sign up for it. Thanks very much.
Ross, thank you. Isn't that what we need in the world, this kind of stuff? Ross, thank you. Please give our thanks to your colleagues at KUOW. My first recollection of Governor Dan Evans was when I was a kid in the 1970s. I was at the Old Settlers Parade in Ferndale. My mom had spread out the blanket, and my brothers and my mom and I were all watching the parade there. And in the parade was the governor of the state of Washington, and he came out of the parade route, and he came up to us, and he shook our hands and said, "Hi, my name is Governor Dan Evans," and shook our hands. And I just remember how starstruck I was that day. I could not believe that the governor of the state of Washington shook our hands. I'm pretty sure that that's the last time a sitting governor has attended the Old Settlers Parade in Ferndale. So I'm calling out publicly Jay Inslee. Jay, if you're watching this online right now, end of July next year, you need to be there. It meant a lot to me then, and it said a lot to me about who the man was. And for a long time, I have held this man in high regard, because how often have you heard, why don't they make politicians like they used to, like Scoop and Maggie and Dan? So that's what today is about. And to formally introduce Governor Dan Evans is our member, Mark Davis.
Thank you, Mark. I do have notes also. I didn't bring his 17-page bio, but when I was reviewing it, and thank you today for speaking on leadership dash, how about followership? That's the title of his presentation today. So I called Dan and I said, there must be something in your past that, you can remember on leadership, early leadership story. And he said, yeah, I was running for vice president at Roosevelt High School when I was a sophomore, when I was 14. And they gave me 3 minutes for my speech, and there were 700 kids in the school at that time. So I closed the presentation I made because I was running against 6 girls. And I closed the presentation that day saying, "May the best man win." That started a 78-year winning streak. The other little-known fact, and I'm sure Geraldine Bouchot, who prompted me on this fact, remembers this. Anybody see the Ken Burns special on Vietnam this last couple weeks? Looks like everybody. Good. So remember at the end there was an issue relating to refugees. And when Dan was listening to the radio, Ross, in the morning, he heard that Governor Brown said no refugees in our state. So that afternoon, Dan Evans said, "Refugees are welcome in our state." Please welcome our honorary member, Straight Arrow, Governor Dan Evans.
Boy, it's nice nice to come back, and I wish that I had kept track of all of the times I've had an opportunity to come and speak to Seattle Rotary. I do remember one of the last times, about 7 years ago, and that was a speech on why I was still a Republican. Now, that was 7 years ago. I began with a little history. In fact, I said I'm still a Republican because it is too difficult to remove the elephant tattoo from my fanny. Well, it still is. Although every time the president tweets, I get restless. Now, these remarks today focus on political leadership from a genetic Republican of 91 years. And I began by looking up leadership in my 1,200-page dictionary, and among the 53 definitions were to go before or with, to show the way, to influence or induce, to command or direct. Not one describes a value of leadership. Is it the leadership of Adolf Hitler, or Napoleon Bonaparte, or Nelson Mandela, or George Washington? Leadership can be brutal, lazy, or dictatorial. It can also be humane, inspired, and dedicated. Leadership really needs an adjective. So let's assume the last three. Today we live in a time when instant electronic communications has radically changed political dialogue for all of us in at least 4 ways. First, information now is very much like an early explorer's definition or description of the Platte River in Nebraska. When he first saw it, he said it was a mile wide, an inch deep, and muddy. 2, everyone has an electronic megaphone today and the ability to spread information widely, true or not. 3, sophistication in presenting information far exceeds that of the receiver of that information. And 4, the 24-hour news cycle is now about 24 minutes. The who, what, why, when, and where of yesterday's reporter has been given way to why not or alternative facts. Compare this with the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 160 years ago. Now, those were real debates. Each candidate had 1.5 hours to present his case. There were no microphones, and audiences as large as 15,000 stood for 3 hours listening. The debates were transcribed by shorthand and printed in many newspapers in their entirety. Pages were posted on outside walls, and crowds gathered to read the details and then engage in their own debates about those candidates, Lincoln or Douglas. Who do you think could cast the most knowledgeable vote? That rural voter of 1858 or the millennial of today with an iPhone filled with information and misinformation? You know, a recent article suggested that the United States was retreating to a form of political tribalism. And I'm afraid that's right. A system where people of like minds gather in a political tribe of similar beliefs, engages in constant warfare with other political tribes, and even rejects social contracts with any of the others. Currently, we have a Trump tribe and probably a Sanders tribe, and a lonely bipartisan collection of centrists attempting to govern. This tribalism was succinctly identified by Seattle City Council person Sawant, who recently said, "I have no Republican friends." How sad. I've never seen a Democratic highway or a Republican school a liberal salmon, or a conservative park. But I have seen lots of important and responsible bipartisan legislation. In my third inaugural address, I declared I would rather cross the political aisle than cross the people. Too often today, politicians get that statement backward. 53 years ago, God, that's a long time ago, following an 18-month campaign, I was elected governor of the state of Washington. And after the euphoria of that winning election waned, I reread our state constitution on the powers of the governor. It states, "The supreme executive power of the state shall be vested in a governor who shall hold his office for a term of 4 years." Now that sounded pretty good until I realized that common school education reported to the superintendent of public instruction. Higher education was governed by boards of trustees and regents. The Highway Commission controlled transportation. The State Parks Department reported to the Parks Commission. The Commissioner of Public Lands controlled 3 million acres of state timberlands. All were selected by my predecessor or elected separately. Supreme executive power at that point sounded pretty hollow. It was made more difficult by a business supporter of mine who said, "Why don't you run government more like a business?" And I rather heatedly responded, "Which business do you want me to run it like, General Motors or Chrysler?" At that point, General Motors was highly profitable and Chrysler was in bankruptcy. Business and government are simply different, although they can borrow good ideas from each other. I decided that there really were two elements that could allow me to lead in spite of limited executive power. As Teddy Roosevelt once said, "I have a bully pulpit," and that is true. When the governor speaks, everyone listens. Well, most everyone. I could set the agenda, which really is powerful. I also presented a unified budget to the legislature, which was rarely modified significantly from its original presentation. Now, all separately elected officials, the Highway Department, the State Parks Department, and education leaders were suddenly eager to talk with the governor. I decided that I better know what should be in that budget. I sat in on more than 100 hours of budget presentations and hearings on each agency. And when the appropriations bill was presented to the legislature, I knew more than anyone else about its details. Now that's powerful knowledge. The late 1960s were a time of political activism. Protests against the war in Vietnam grew in intensity. Environmental challenges vied with civil rights for attention. When I was just a youngster, my grandfather gave me some pretty good advice on leadership. When he said, "You have 2 ears to listen and 1 mouth to talk, so you should listen twice as much as you talk." It was advice that I would now heed. In early August of 1967, I decided it was important to meet with the citizens of the Central area in Seattle. We announced that the governor would be at the East Madison YMCA the afternoon of August 2nd to meet with anyone who wished to talk with him. It was a hot afternoon, and the YMCA had no air conditioning. A large crowd was gathered waiting for appointments, and I was led to a small room with a table and half a dozen chairs. Bill Lathrop, my State Patrol aide, led the first man in. I greeted him, and we sat down, just the two of us, for a conversation. I found that he had a problem with Social Security, which he did want solved. I led him out to meet with a staff member who would help him contact the Social Security Administration. Most of the people I met with that day had individual problems with one level of government or another, and we attempted to quickly put them in touch with someone who could help them out. As we reached the end of the afternoon, Bill Lathrop introduced a group of women who announced that they had just come to welcome the governor to their community. They were dressed in fine clothes, wearing white gloves and decorative hats. I ordered coffee and tea, and we had a delightful conversation about family and community. As they left, I was told that there was one more group waiting to see me. The door opened, and 6 African-American teenagers marched in. I introduced myself, and then the tirade began. Several talked at once, but the message was clear. They hated conditions in their community and demanded change. Finally, one young man pulled his chair around to the other end of the table, faced me, pointed his finger at me like this, with his forefinger out and thumb raised. In an ominous voice, he exclaimed, "Governor, if I had a gun right now, I'd shoot you." He simultaneously lowered his thumb as if the gun's trigger was pulled. The room turned deadly silent. I waited, mostly to steady my voice, and finally said, "What good would that do?" He immediately replied, "One less honky to deal with." Now that was dramatic leadership, and it sure got my attention. That exchange was too much for the rest of the group, and they realized they had reached the end of the meeting. As they prepared to leave, one turned to me and said, "Governor, why don't you come home with me to dinner tonight and see how we have to live?" I replied, "I'm speaking to a large group immediately after this meeting, but I would like to come some other time." And he shyly replied, "I'll have to ask my mother first." That broke the tension, and the mad, determined zealots turned into the teenagers they really were. Before they left, I challenged them by stating, "You have spent your time with me talking about all that is wrong with your community. I need to know what to do about it, and I would like you to come to my office a week from now and bring some ideas that would help." They left talking to themselves, determined to travel to Olympia the next week. Frankly, I doubted that they would come. But a week later, they showed up, dressed in their best clothes and ready with a long list of demands. The list was titled "Concrete Proposals of the Grassroots Group." But as the meeting began, their spokesman made it clear that these were demands. Well, I was already familiar with that term, since this is the common jargon of all protest groups. I was presented with a list, and we began what turned into a fascinating 2-hour discussion. There were 18 astonishingly pertinent items, and these youngsters were prepared to argue them in depth. They spoke of education, asking that Afro-American history be included in the school curriculum. Central area teachers be given specialized training for Negro problems, and they proposed use of indigenous teacher aides. We debated for some time the allocation of funds between schools. They claimed with considerable evidence that schools outside the central area had different and/or better equipment. they turned to the University of Washington, asking for more scholarship aid and the use of university talent for research into interracial problems. Next, we debated job opportunities. They talked of civil service impediments, excessive testing requirements, and were most intense about the lack of opportunity in labor union apprenticeship programs. Now, they turned to aid the dependent children, with requests for training programs for mothers and daycare centers. They spoke of the problem of reducing aid when income rose, especially income earned by children. I was astonished because they had focused directly on a technical problem we already had with the federal government, and I thought they were absolutely right in that challenge. We even discussed the Evergreen Point Bridge. They wondered if it had to be built and what would be done about the residents forced to move. The original plans for the bridge included the R.H. Thompson Freeway, which would run north and south through the central area and the Arboretum before connecting with the Evergreen Point Bridge. We were partners on this issue since I thoroughly agreed that the R.H. Thompson Freeway was a mistake and it was never built. Their number one issue on which we spent much of the discussion was a request for a centralized state office in Seattle's central area. They asked with considerable passion why a resident had to ride 2 bus routes to get to the Public Assistance Office near Queen Anne, and then 2 bus routes to the Rainier Valley to visit the State Health Department. They asked, why can't all of the offices that serve our community be located in one place in our community? Well, we were reaching the end of the meeting, and I said we will look into every one of these requests and report back to you on action. I ended by saying your suggestion for a central area office is a great one, and I promise that we will open such an office in your community in 30 days. 30 days later, the multi-service center was opened. We were still searching for a director. We finally selected Vince Hayes, a young man working in Utah who had grown up in the central area. He was shortly to be joined by Robert Flowers, who also grew up in the community and was finishing his graduate work at the University of Washington School of Public Affairs. They were both in their mid-20s, had no models to work from, and no direct appropriation. They did have intelligence, endless energy, and knew their community. Vince later had a long career with the Social Security Administration, and Bob retired as Senior Vice President of the Washington Mutual Bank. I had insisted, however, that the new center be attached to the governor's office, since there was no department in which it would really fit. That gave Vince and Bob the clout they needed, and when the central area, or when the center opened, there was a central intake and the desks of representatives of many appropriate state agencies. Interestingly, before long, the city of Seattle asked to join, and the federal government brought in their Social Security and several other agencies. It was truly a people-oriented, multi-service, multi-government agency. And a few weeks after the center opened, we held a formal reception and invited a long list of public officials along with an open invitation to people of the community. The place was packed when I arrived, and as I circulated through the room, I was met by an elderly lady who approached me and proudly said, "Governor, how do you like our center?" I had a lump, still do. My throat as big as a softball. When I responded, I said, "I think it's terrific." She captured in 7 words what government should represent when she said our instead of your or their. Well, my grandfather's admonition to listen was wise advice. 6 black teenagers gave me direction that was smart, sophisticated, and needed. The age of citizen activism was clearly in full throat, and I was determined to let the voices of all citizens be heard. A little over a year later, a formal ribbon cutting and reception was held in the offices of the Liberty Bank, the first black-owned bank in the state. After the formal ribbon cutting, we mingled with a large crowd, filling and overflowing the bank offices. During the middle of the reception, voices suddenly died down, and an uneasy silence fell over that crowd. The visitors parted, and I saw a half-dozen young people approaching me, carrying a huge machete encased in a leather sheath. Nearby guests were uneasy, and Bill Lathrop wondered what to do about my security. Well, the spokesman for the small group approached and said, "Governor, we really liked what you did in opening the multi-service center, and so we made this machete for you as a gift." The audience let out an audible sigh of relief. And the reception continued as I exclaimed over the leather workmanship and the sharpness of the machete. I used that machete for many years to cut brush and was reminded each time of the extraordinary events connected with this sharp instrument. Now, each summer while I was governor, we hired more than 100 college interns who served in many agencies of state government. Once a week, I would host a brown bag lunch for those interns on the mansion lawn. I would ask how they were doing, and I received a flood of information in return. They asked why agencies were performing functions that were questionable or seemed unnecessary. They suggested merging activities and streamlining departments. The luncheons were fascinating, fun, and rewarding. At my next sub-cabinet meeting, I would ask leading questions, and as the meeting ended, I could hear agency heads muttering, "How the hell did he know about that?" Well, a number of new improvements evolved out of listening to the fresh voices of smart college students. Well, how do these stories really relate to leadership? They describe 4 elements which I believe are essential to being an effective leader. First, knowledge. Study the issues you face, learn the facts that will guide you, and have a clear idea of what you want to accomplish. 2, listen carefully, especially to those you are leading. Hearing is not enough. I've had plenty of people tell me, "I hear you," but they're really not listening. Hearing is to perceive by the ear, while listening is to pay attention. And 3, respect. It's vital to respect those who are part of your team, and important to respect even those with whom you disagree. And ethics. A high standard of ethics and honesty is necessary for successful long-term leadership. Without it, leadership ultimately fails. Now, I've talked about leadership from a political perspective, but I also serve on the board of directors of Costco. Their dramatic code of ethics describes intelligent corporate leadership in a few powerful words. 1, obey the law. 2, take care of our members. 3, take care of our employees. 4, respect our vendors. And 5, If we do these 4 things throughout our organization, then we will realize our ultimate goal, which is to reward our shareholders. I think they had it right, and they have it right in the right order. Finally, leaders without followers are lonely ghosts, and followers without leaders are a mob. Success comes when leaders and followers join as a team to reach a common goal enhanced by living these leadership principles. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you stand by for one quick question?
Oh, sure. That'll always be. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
So, Governor, check. Governor, I wish we had time for a half hour of questions. So I'm just going to ask you one question, if you would, before we have to wrap up. As you look at Olympia now, today, what advice would you give our elected lawmakers there?
Talk to each other. Across the aisle, frankly, I'm not a pessimist with what Olympia is all about. I know a good many of the legislators. In fact, I was asked 4 or 5 years ago by a new young legislator. He said, we have developed an under 40s caucus in Olympia, and we'd like to have you go on a hike with us. I said, okay. So we went with half a dozen legislators, both Democrats and Republicans, who were all under 40, and the hike was short enough. But the important part was we all gathered for lunch in North Bend, at the Tweedy Cafe, and spent the next couple of hours in a fascinating conversation about government and politics. And we've done this now for the last 5 years. And I have come to really respect even more the intelligence, the willingness to work together of those young legislators coming along. We've got a strong bench in both parties, and a willingness, at least for now, of those to talk and work with each other. Hopefully they won't lose that as they grow into positions of leadership. So I'm an optimist. I think that the state of Washington is likely to do maybe a lot better and a lot faster than our national government.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Governor, thank you for your leadership. You have set the bar high, and you're an example and an inspiration to all of us as to how we should lead in our personal lives and in our businesses. I just want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your service to our great state. You are truly an inspiration, and we are truly grateful for you. Thank you. We're adjourned.